Since tomorrow we will be getting together to celebrate the birth of our nation, I thought we should have a brief history lesson. And for those of you who are offended by my shirt, I think you especially need to hear this. And of course, some people would say, well, why would people be offended by your shirt? Well, I had an incident a few years ago where a similar shirt was in 1776. And supposedly people were offended because there were slaves back then. And when I talked to actual black people about it, they said, well, they had no problem with it. There was other people who were being offended for them. So, with that in mind, we are going to take a look at how we came to be. For people my age and older, when we talked about famous explorers, one of the first, of course, we hear about Christopher Columbus, who discovered America, which isn't exactly true. He never actually landed on the mainland. He landed in the West Indies, so he kind of took a southern route down, following the winds and stuff. Because his goal was, of course, that we all learned how he was trying to find a westward way to get to India. And so the people he initially met on the West Indies, the natives there, he initially called those Indians. And that's why for many centuries, the people of that race that we have here in the United States, we have called from the Eskimos or Inuits all the way down to the tip of South America, these people we called Indians. Only till the last century when we started calling them Native Americans because some people were offended. But I digress. So Columbus didn't actually land on the mainland, and of course we hear about Leif Erikson, who actually landed in Nova Scotia. But the first people who came here were the Pilgrims. But why did they come here? For years people have said that America was a Christian nation. And then when Barack Obama was president, he had the audacity to say, because of all the refugees that he brought over here from known terrorist countries, that we were no longer a Christian nation. And how would he know that? Well, and also, we get people when they talk about how the beginnings of our nations, they say, well, they weren't Christians, they were deists. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. The reason why the early pilgrims came to America, or what would be known as America, is because of religious persecution. And that goes back to the time of Henry VIII in England, where when he got married, he disagreed with the wife, either beheaded her or divorced her. Well, he was married and he decided that he wanted to get a divorce. Well, the Pope told him that it was against their faith to divorce. And so Henry VIII decided, well, he was going to do a little end around move, and he came up with the Church of England. And he decided that everyone in his kingdom had to worship at the Church of England. And so it was still basically Christianity, but at the same time, he made up some of his own stuff to go along with it, which didn't actually go along with the Catholic Church. So some of the early people who were from England, to avoid persecution, fled to the Netherlands. America was not their first stop. They went to the Netherlands first. And after some time there, they didn't like how things were going there. So they decided to make the journey on a little ship called the Mayflower across a big ocean, which at that time was an extremely dangerous type of voyage. And they set sail for the New World. When they finally made it there, of course, they had to endure many hardships. You know, we know how the first Thanksgiving went. But it was a rough time. They had to get the help from the natives to show them how to survive in this new world. Well, as time progressed, more people came over and formed different colonies, but they were still technically attached to England. So things got to be pretty bad during the colonial times under King George because he was taxing them for everything. England was the main source of their imports. And so everything that they received, it was just King George had this ridiculous tax over them. Now you had some people who were actually quite wealthy. We would call them, some were what you call gentleman farmers, like George Washington was one of those. And yes, Washington had slaves. And before this gets off keel, I can guarantee that while it was still wrong to own people, it was not the same as it would be during the Civil War or the war between the states, depending what area you live. But yes, there were some bad things that happened during colonial time, but let us not erase everything that these people have done. It's history. We are to learn from it. So, in 1770, up in the Massachusetts ports, there became kind of a bitter rivalry between the English sailors and the colonial sailors. It was a competition, but it wasn't very friendly competition. And so around this time, there was a man named Crispus Attucks. I'm probably saying his name wrong. Like history people could tell me better how to say it. But he was a runaway slave who earned a living as a sailor and a rope maker. Well, around this time, a big event happened called the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks allied himself with the colonial sailors and the people in Boston, and he fought alongside fellow colonists against the British. He is also the first man that was killed during this time, and he is considered to be the first man to fall for what will be considered the rebellion against the British. Now, there are several others who had fought for the colonies and some even against the colonies with the British. But I digress. Things got to be pretty rough. And Jefferson and Franklin, they both had went over trying to get England to reason. They did everything they could diplomatically to try to get England to see their side. England wasn't having it. As far as King George was concerned, you might not be in the same continent anymore, but you're still part of us. And a lot of the early colonists were getting fed up because the British troops that would be all over the place were often taking provision that they needed themselves. But the British would take that and say, we take this in the name of the king and all this stuff. And so you had delegates who came from Philadelphia, from all 13 of the original colonies, to try to figure out what they could do. Do we try diplomacy some more, or do we finally say enough is enough? Well, it was finally on July 4th, 1776, that our Declaration of Independence was adopted. But it wasn't until August 2nd of 1776 when it officially had been put down on parchment, which for all the young people, that was the early form of paper, which they had to use ink and a feather, a quill, a feather of some kind to do their writing. It was August 2nd of 1776 when the delegates actually signed it. Now, an interesting note is that on the initial first copy, there were only two names on the document, which those of John Hancock, who was the president of the Continental Congress at the time, and Secretary Charles Thomson. Thomas Jefferson was 33 years old when he wrote it, which I think is interesting because he was 33 years old when he drafted this document, which would change the lives of millions and millions and billions of people afterwards. He didn't write it by himself. He did a lot, but he was helped out some by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And what he called the Declaration of Independence was an expression of the mind. Now, it's important to know they almost gave up on it when they were still trying to draft it. And this is where Benjamin Franklin, this person, this so-called deist, who said that in the beginning of their proceedings, every day, they always called on prayer to help them, deliver them, so that they could form a new nation. And he said they had kind of gotten away with it, got away from it, I should say, and that they need to put this matter to God in prayer. And the next thing you know, the Declaration was formed. Another important note about the Declaration is that the people who signed this important document knew that by doing so, they were putting their lives on the line. Great Britain would consider them as traitors to the crown. And so, as you gather tomorrow for your picnics and barbecues, and as you watch the parades, and as you look up at the fireworks and go ooh and ah, it's a time to reflect on everything and everyone of those early colonialists who finally had enough to tell England to back off so we could become the country that we are today. And yes, just like in those days, we have a lot of problems. But I think this country can turn around if we give our leaders the proper push. So in closing, I'm just going to say, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat or Libertarian or whatever. Because these brave men and women we get to enjoy the freedoms that we have today. And on that note, I say, God bless America.